Now I feel like I've been riding loads of ridiculously quick bikes recently, things like the Triumph Speed Triple RR. We went out to Italy to ride the MV Agusta Brutale 1000 RS and the F3 RR. And at the moment I've got the KTM 1290 Super Duke R Evo in the garage. But the thing is, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but you really don't need all that performance to have a good time on the public road. There's plenty of fun to be had at a lower price point and a lower peak power figure on a bike like this, the Kawasaki Z650RS. Not the fanciest spec, not the most exhilarating performance figures, but you can still have a great time, at least at road legal speeds, and you can do it in bags of style. So in this video, I'll tell you absolutely everything you need to know about this beautiful little retro from Kawasaki.
Before we get started, a massive thanks to OptiMate for sponsoring this video. OptiMate is the leading brand in battery chargers and maintainers, and for a city bike like this where you might be relying on it for your morning commute, it's super important to keep your battery looked after. Now you can either go down the plug-in route with a product like the OptiMate 2. I managed to flat my Indian FTR the other day when I left the ignition on while I was filming it, and this bad boy had it firing up again in no time. Or if you're a city dweller and perhaps you don't have access to a garage with power, then they've got you covered with this, their solar charger. Genius! I've also been super impressed with the range of accessories they offer, so that once you've got the tether hooked up to your battery, you can use it as a USB port to charge your phone on the go, or get a DC adapter to power heated clothing. So once again, a massive thanks to OptiMate for sponsoring this video, and there are links down in the description where you can find out more about their awesome product range.
So let's start by talking about the engine on this bike, and it's their 649cc parallel twin with a 180-degree crank, and it's the same engine that you'll find in all their other 650 platform bikes, so the Ninja 650, Versys 650, and perhaps closest, the Z650 Modern Naked. Power figures aren't market leading. It's 68 PS at 8,000 RPM and 64 Newton meters of peak torque at 6,700. The other thing is it's not the best sounding engine either in terms of that 180-degree crank. Either the 270 crank on the XSR 700 or the inline triple on the Trident, you know, both of those bikes sound way better to me, but that's not to say this engine doesn't have plenty of redeeming features. Unlike the XSR, it does get an assist and slipper clutch, so that means it gets the assist part, which gives you a light feel at the lever, and also the slipper part, which means that the rear wheel won't lock up under aggressive downshifts. It's also super smooth, surprisingly smooth I'd say for a twin. I think it's a very comfortable engine to ride on, and the fueling is very nice and smooth as well. There's not much choppiness on and off the throttle, and it has a nice, smooth and approachable delivery right through the rev range. Speaking of which, it also feels happier than I'd have expected higher up in the rev range. Some bikes start to vibe quite hard when you really start pushing them, but this just feels happy, be it down low, you know, pottering around town, or when you get a bit of open road and you can open it up. There's just enough there for me to have a good, fun riding experience on the road. It's fast enough that it doesn't feel boring, even for someone who rides a decent amount like myself, but also it's not so much that you feel like you're just tickling the throttle and not really working it hard. The only downside perhaps is that it gets a 12-litre tank, which isn't massive, but it's fairly economical, this engine, and so you still get, I don't know, about 150 miles of range out of it, which should be enough realistically for the sort of riding that this bike will do. It's very much the same story with the chassis as well, so it might not look on paper like a market-leading bike, but it all comes together quite nicely to deliver a really nice riding experience. Suspension is simple, so you've got a 41mm right way up fork that's non-adjustable. You get their horizontal backlink style shock at the rear. That is preload adjustable, although the preload adjuster is super difficult to get at. I think you'd have to remove a side panel to get a C-spanner on it, and so for me that's quite a significant drawback if you often switch between riding solo and two up, but for regular road riding, at least if you're just riding solo, it performs pretty well. You can tell it's not the best of the best, it's not super supple, but it's comfy enough and it handles well enough and it's composed enough and it realistically suits the rest of the spec of the bike. Braking again is simple. You've got 2-pot Nissin calipers here on 300mm discs, but again they do the job nicely and it's not a big heavy bike. It's 187 kilograms curb, and so it doesn't really need massive powerful stoppers to haul it up. That lightness is probably one of its major strengths. It really does feel like a nice easy bike to ride, nice and agile and maneuverable for around town, but also it's got that sort of lightness that makes it fun to ride on country back roads. For me though, I think the major strength of this bike is the sort of comfortable riding position. Firstly, the handlebars, you can see how much they sweep up, and so you end up with a very upright and easygoing angle with your back. And then the RS also sits quite a bit higher in the seat height than the regular modern looking Z650. Part of that is going to be just how cushy this seat is, so it's got a nice spongy feel to it, and not only does it mean that you're sat up a little bit more with a more commanding riding position, but also gives you plenty of room down to the foot pegs. And so for me, this is a really comfy bike, not terribly sporty, but I don't think it needs to be for the sort of rider who's realistically going to consider buying one. All of your weight feels like it's back on the saddle, which is great for sort of town riding, and you've got a good view of the road and traffic ahead without having to crane your neck, and so this is a big tick for me for this bike. Tech-wise, we don't have a great deal to talk about here. There's not really anything apart from ABS. Similar to the XSR 700 in that way, but I did talk about the Triumph Trident earlier, and that's a much more techy offering. This certainly goes more down the simplicity route, and although you do get a beautiful cockpit with twin analog clocks and then a digital readout in between, the data within is just limited to the regular basic stuff like trip meters and fuel consumption. But do you realistically need like fancy riding modes and traction control on a bike with 68 PS peak? Probably not. It might be a little bit of a comfort to some novice riders in wet conditions perhaps, but like I say, that throttle delivery is nice and smooth, and so I don't think it's an intimidating bike to ride even without fancy rider aids. But you know what it lacks in tech, it absolutely makes up for in terms of looks. A couple of years before this bike we had the Z900RS. That's an inline 4 and a little bit more performance orientated, and that bike pays tribute to the iconic Z1 of the 1970s. This bike takes a lot of the same themes and ideas and just applies it to their 650 platform, and personally I think it's a massive success. Realistically, this is about as good looking a retro bike as you could possibly make based on a modern engine and chassis, and if you compare it to a picture of a Z650 from the 70s, there's actually a surprising amount of similarities. Clearly they've matched the colour of the paint and the pinstriping, but also the headlight and brackets, the twin clocks, the covering on the seat and the little ducktail, and even stuff like they haven't just carried the regular mirrors over from the Z650, they've given it its own little retro round ones. Whether you like it or not, a lot of people buy bikes based on how they look, and I expect this one to turn a lot of heads in the showroom. So again, it's a massive tick from me in the styling department for this bike, and also the quality of the finish really does look better than this bike's price point. You see, it's pretty competitive. It starts at $7,649 for the most basic paint option, and then of course add a little bit for some other colors, and that makes the starting price a little more affordable than the XSR 700. I'd say this is a far better looking bike as well, so it seems like a pretty good deal. And so the other option to consider for me is the Trident 660. That bike is a little cheaper and offers a bit more performance, but again, aesthetically I don't think it can touch this bike. A bit of a predicament, but fortunately I've got a direct head-to-head of those two bikes in the studio coming in the next couple of days. If you're watching this in the future, I'll have already linked to it down below here, so you can click it and watch it. If you're not watching it in the future, this will just be blank, or maybe I'll put something else here.